What if there was a mysterious society that channeled the currents of Hollywood from the shadows of the industry, pulling the strings of film and TV production, deciding who makes what and why and how, barricaded from the outside world by invisible elections and powerful networks? And what if that society was hidden in plain sight, in the credits of the movies and TV shows we watch every day? Today, Sean Albertson, one of Hollywood's top living editors, have earned hundreds of millions of dollars of box office returns, takes us behind the closed doors of the enigmatic American Cinema Editors Society and answers the big question: what does it take to join ACE?
My father was a film editor, and the story I was told later, the part of the story I know is that I went home one day and I guess I was in 11th grade in high school and told my parents I was not going to take the SATs and decided not to go to college just yet. I was going to pursue a career in music and or the restaurant industry. Both were careers that my father had been in before he became a film editor. And then the story I was told years later was that my mother said to my father, "You better bring him to work and show him what real life is like because that kid needs to go to college." So it's essentially how I got my start. I graduated high school. My father brought me I grew up in New York and had me spend 4 weeks just seeing what he does and seeing how they do it and sort of looking into the idea of filmmaking as a job, really just a job at that point.
So you learned watching him work. Was he giving you parts to play in that? Did you ever get to organize footage?
Ultimately, what happened was he put me with an old assistant of his who was now editing some lower budget things, mostly TV movies. My dad was sort of the king of TV MOW editors in New York at that time. This was in the mid '80s, and so he stuck me with an old assistant, and I interned for an entire low budget movie, and there is where I got to learn sort of the ins and outs of the editing room. I had not at that point learned anything about editing itself. Uh, 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 from a creative standpoint, it was all about the technicalities of running the editing room, what I need to do as an assistant editor to provide for my editor, and it was all very, very technical. It still is, but it was even more so back then because it was all very hands-on, actual film, right? So like, at that time, it was 1986, and everything was still being edited on 35 millimeter, 16 millimeter with the big clunky pieces of equipment that they would use.
Cool. And so what led to that first job where you were the lead editor after this time working as an assistant?
I got my first apprentice film editor job and got into the union and worked my way through the assistant world. And I still hadn't really studied film editing at that point, really didn't really understand it. It was all the technical aspects of being an assistant editor. Um, and my passions at the time were music and food, cooking. Both of those passions I had gotten from my dad, who, as I said, had been a musician and a chef before I was born. Um, and somebody contacted me who apparently had gone to my high school, who had graduated a couple of years after me. He was a film student at NYU. Somebody had said to him, "Sean Albertson is a film editor." I was not. I was an assistant film editor, but he called me and said, "I'm doing my senior thesis. I need an editor. Would you edit my senior thesis for no money?" And so I said, "Sure." And then I went to my dad and I was like, "How do I do?" So that experience, finally asking my father for sort of guidance in like how would I do the job that you actually do, not the job that I've been learning, which is how to log and draw grease pencils on film. All of the creativity that I love about music and about cooking were sort of transmuted into the art and craft of filmmaking. In fact, I've had directors come over for dinner at my house that I've worked with, and a couple of them have said to me, watching you cook is very much like watching you edit my movie. Like, and I really credit my father with helping me find those creative connections, right? Of like, try a little of this, that's not working. This is kind of sour. That's not what I'm looking for. What do I do next to figure out how to provide for my audience what I'm trying to provide for them? I do that when I cook, and clearly do that as a film editor.
That's awesome.
It's a fun, like, there is no one way to become an editor, or really anything that we do in this industry. And I love that, like, it feels like a very unique story, as they all are. And I love that, my dad was able to provide that for me.
And so you were helping film students with their thesis films, but you yourself had not gone to film school. Is that right?
That is correct. I went right out of high school, started, just sort of hanging around, and then did an internship, and then sort of worked my way up through the apprentice, assistant,
Mm-hmm.
and editor thing. And becoming an editor, a lot of people sort of work their way up through the assistant ranks, and then editors let them start to cut things. That isn't really my story. I worked with a great old editor named Sam Osteen, who was a mentor in some ways, more in like how to get your rate
Oh,
as high as you can get it.
that's important.
It wasn't like a creative partnership, like I like to have that with my assistants. I always let everybody edit, and I let them bring me things and show me, and I note and do all these things. I didn't really have that, also because my dad was not editing anymore at that point.
Mm.
And so I just started looking around and trying to get my hands on anything I could edit. And at one point, I was an assistant editor on a big movie that I got fired from because I was kind of a shitty assistant editor. And I was in Los Angeles, still living in New York, and I decided, you know what? And I had sort of followed a girl out to Los Angeles as well, and I said, I'm just going to move here. This is where everything's happening. I want to be an editor. I don't want to be an assistant anymore. I'm not a very good assistant. So I moved everything across the country, and I just started cold calling and mailing at the time, not even emailing, cold calling and mailing all the post-production people I could like think of, people I had worked with as an assistant, people, who were heads of post-production. And the kind of short version of it is, I got a guy on the phone. He was the head of post-production for Spelling Entertainment TV at the time. And he was like, all right, I've got this, really low budget, super ambitious little TV show. Like, there's no money. Why don't you edit it? And that was kind of the start.
Cool. So pause the story for a moment and dig into what was the role of the assistant editor then, and how has that changed for today's films and TV shows?
It's very different. It was a very clerical and physical job, right?
Mm.
So we would get rolls and rolls of 35 millimeter picture and sound. And so our days during the shoot were filled with putting these rolls of film through a hot machine that would put code numbers on it, running that film through a synchronizer and logging in a logbook, handwritten logbook, all of those numbers that we put on, the latent edge numbers, which are tiny and backward and
Mm.
upside down as you're rolling it through, and you have to learn to read those. Putting all that in a logbook, syncing the picture to the sound, and then the logging is what numbers indicate what scene and take number this is. So then we take all that information, take the sound and picture, which we have sunk together, break those down into small rolls of, scene one, take one, with a little handwritten piece of paper on top of it so the editor knows what this
Mm.
roll of film is sitting
Mm.
on his table. Um, So that's sort of the main job while they're shooting a movie. And then just again just prepping that stuff so the editor has what the editor needs. And then another big part of the process of the job, which is I think how mentoring really happened back then, was one assistant would often stand right over the shoulder of the editor, because the editor, once you cut open those rolls of film, you had to hang the other pieces that you're not using in this film bin,
Wow.
with that little piece of paper. And so the editor would often just look at the line script, which tells you what was shot and what the take number is. And the editor would say, okay, I'm looking for, this code number on this take. And the assistant editor would stand there siphoning through and then hold the editor a piece of film.
So manual. Wow, that's amazing.
Like I remember, there was one point when I was an apprentice film editor, and there was a guy like installing telephones in our room, and he was there all day long, and he like at the end of the day he was like, "So you just turn that wheel all day? That's your job?" Like I was like literally cranking a film reel all
That's
day long.
wild. Would your arm tire? Would you get exhausted or cramp?
Yeah, yeah, shoulders. Like I had really good shoulders back.
Oh, I'm sure you did. Just working out all day. Wow.
That's how assistants used to get to learn how to edit. They would literally stand over the shoulder of their editor,
Hmm.
watching every cut they're making.
Hmm.
And so I think that was a great
That's cool.
training ground.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And would you ever make suggestions or ask questions to lead someone?
My assistant career wasn't quite what I was just describing. Like
Hmm.
I ultimately, it was like my first job as a first assistant editor on a big movie, I ended up getting fired from for a number of reasons. So I usually wasn't, I was like the second assistant or the apprentice, and I was usually the guy in the back room with the hot machine putting numbers on it, you know
Okay.
what I mean? So I wasn't really the guy standing over the shoulder.
What did you get fired for on that feature?
Um, I mean, I'll make a long story short. So I was a second assistant editor for Sam Osteen, who had edited all of Mike Nichols'
Oh,
movies up to
wow.
that point. They were splitting up.
Okay.
They had decided, whoever, I don't know who it was that made the decision, they were not working together anymore.
So this was their last film.
So I was on their last film together. Mike Nichols goes to direct The Birdcage and is hiring Artie Schmidt as his editor. So Mike asked me if I, because Mike had been working with Sam for 40 years and wanted a little bit of comfort in the editing room. And so he asked me if I would come on. And I said to Mike, I would love to, but I really want to be editing. If I could be like some kind of editor on the movie, I would love to do that. So Mike flies me out to LA to have lunch with Artie Schmidt. We have a great lunch. Ultimately, the short story is I thought I was being hired as like a second editor or a co editor. He thought he was hiring me as his first assistant editor. When we finally, because that never came up in the conversation during our lunch, when we finally had that conversation about a month and a half into the job, he said, "No, I'm not. I don't need another editor. I'm not hiring another editor. Do you want the job as my first assistant?" I said yes. And then 2 weeks later, he just said, "You know what? It's just not working out." Um,
How has that role of the AE evolved today? What is your team? How do they support you?
Well, I'm probably more interested in creative in having the best creative support from my team, so rather than the technical stuff. So, for instance, not not more interested, but because they've got to set me up the way I need to be set up to do my job, right? That's super important. But what comes first and foremost for me when hiring a crew, particularly a first and a second assistant editor, is, are you good with sound editing? Can you do, some semi-basic temp visual effects? Can you do some color correction in the Avid? Can you edit? Like I love having my team do edits. There are times at which I'm going through material, I'm trying to put a sequence together, and in that moment, my brain cannot get it right. I cannot wrap my head around creatively what I'm looking for, what the footage is telling me, what the director wants, and I'll have to let it go. Sometimes I will literally pass that along to an assistant and say, put something together. And editing is very difficult to do from scratch. Putting it together for the first time, assembling a scene is kind of the most arduous, probably my least favorite part of the process. It's the most internally combative for me
Mm.
because constantly questioning, is this the right move? Am I doing this correctly? Um, and then it's always much easier to re-edit something or
Mm.
to rewrite something
Yeah,
once it's already put together. So the role of assistants has obviously changed. It's less physically taxing in that you're not carrying around reels of film and running them through
right.
machines and having to log. And a lot of that metadata that I was telling you that I used to write in this logbook it, is usually already added.
I
It's
see.
it's coming from camera, going to the facility that's creating your dailies for you in Avid or whatever program you're using, and there's tons of metadata already
Mm.
built in. Usually, it's already sunk as well, picture and sound. So the assistant's job at that point is to lay out that footage the way the editor can best take it in. Like me, for instance, the way I have my editing bins, I've got it in frame mode, and I like to have it laid out in a certain way with wide shots first, and then everything on that side of the line, and then everything on this side of the line. I'm sure all editors have things set up differently, but so it's to really set that stuff up the way the editor wants. It's dealing with all kinds of requests coming in from other departments, and then really importantly to me is like, let's what we do. I believe is all about presentation, which means that the work I'm doing as an editor, putting these scenes together, I want that to have its best shot being presented. So I want um, a pretty extensive sound and temp music job done before we show it to anybody. I heavily rely on my crew to help me with that stuff and also editing, like creatively I'm asking for people's opinions. I want to know, like, do you think this works? If it doesn't, like, why don't you think it works? If I think something's working and an assistant comes to me and says, I think it would be better if you tried this, I'll just say, yeah, go ahead, go for it. Show
Cool.
me.
What's the typical career path of someone who starts as a second assistant? How do they get to you? How do you find them? And then are they typically working their way up to be a lead editor on features or TV?
I find that usually assistant editors are sort of trying to work their way up. When I first got into this business in the 80s, nobody nobody was really looking to become an editor. Not many people really knew what editing was.
Oh, interesting.
Um, like people sort of happened into it. Like my dad happened into editing. I find that there were a lot of musicians that sort of like somehow ended up in like a music control room, you know, person, and then they somehow like got into like film sound, and then somebody kind of was like, oh, they put these things
Funny.
together. Nobody, there wasn't at that time, there was, as far as I knew, there was no like film school
Mm,
editing classes. Like it was like, you're learning how to be a filmmaker, and sure, they show you the machinery and how to cut your things together, um but yeah, I'd say most assistant editors ultimately are looking to become editors, and like I said before, there's no one path. I mean, the absolute path, I think, to succeeding, to becoming an editor and succeeding as an editor is just to do the best, like just kick ass, just do the best job you can do, whatever task you're being given. I've had my current first assistant editor on the movie I just finished was my PA, was my editorial PA 7 years ago. And so I had this movie come up. I was looking to crew in New York. It was a very difficult time to crew because everybody was extremely busy. And this guy who had been my PA, who was a great PA. I mean, talk about like, whatever your task is, do it well, be thoughtful about it, details matter. That's what I believe. That's how I do my job. That's how I ask the people who work for me to do their jobs. And that's how he did his job as a PA, getting coffee, getting lunch, checking in, making sure we were okay, anything else we need, that kind of thing. And so he stayed in contact with me over the years. And when I was looking for a first and second assistant editor in New York, he contacted me and saw on some posting that I was looking, and we talked about him being the second assistant editor. Everybody was super busy, and then I talked to a couple of people who were qualified, but I just wasn't feeling it. And so I said to this guy, like, how about you're the first assistant editor and we'll hire somebody else as the second assistant, and whatever you lack in experience, like just kick ass and be willing to learn. And he was like, great. And it worked out great. So, so my best advice is always do your best, always. Like life is life and we all have shitty days, and bad things happen around us, but I like to enjoy being at work. And again, I have bad days, and fight in the family or somebody gets sick or whatever it is, but we have a lot of fun on my cruise. And so just have a as positive an attitude as you can have, and at least pretend you want to be there. And for me, that's how you get on my radar. Like for me, it's like good attitude. If I don't know something, I'm going to do my best to figure it out. Um, I don't I don't want to hear no or I don't know too many times. I like what I'd rather hear is like I'm okay with I don't know. I just don't want I don't know, period. I want I don't know. Let me
Right.
look into that
Right.
and get back
Yeah.
to you in a little
Okay.
while.
And how important is their reel or their samples for that getting that second assistant job? Let's say they've been cutting like their own commercials or their own music videos or things like that. Does that make a difference?
I have never had an assistant, because anytime I interview my assistants, I certainly tell them, I'm really looking for somebody who can do all the
Hmm.
technical stuff, but who's also interested in the creative and can be helpful in the creative. Um, I think it would be super cool if an assistant said to me, "Hey, check out my reel, check out
Yeah.
my website. Here's the stuff I've been doing." I think that would be great. I could look at something and be like, "Wow, that's the sound work
Yeah.
on that is great."
So what's the best way for them to learn that technical stuff that you're looking for?
Trying to get in as a editorial production assistant, post production assistant, and then when you're there and you're doing a great job, say to the assistant editors, the second assistant, the first assistant, and the editor, I'm here to learn. Like I'm going to do a great job for you. What else can you give me that like what can I do for you to
Mm.
take some load off uh, what you're doing? That's a great way. Obviously, YouTube videos on learning the systems that we use, like Avid. I tend to edit with Avid Media Composer. I would recommend learning Premiere and DaVinci, maybe even Final Cut Pro, even though nobody really seems to use that anymore. But I would say, for television and features, first and foremost, Avid Media Composer, and there's plenty of free video guides out there to help people learn that stuff. And then again, really importantly, is to get into a situation where you're connected to the actual process, because learning how those softwares work is one thing, but learning how the editing room
Mm.
system works is completely different. You can be a technical whiz at Avid Media Composer. It definitely does not mean you have the skills to be my assistant editor. There are ways that we do things. There are ways that things are organized and templates made and line scripts and all
Mm.
kinds of things that that go into it. And so I think, learning, so knowing how to use the softwares is super important, obviously. So if we have a PA, if we're interviewing for production assistant, and the production assistant says, I know Avid, I know Premiere, I know DaVinci, so, whatever you guys need me to do
That's
there, like
cool. Yeah.
that's a real plus for me. And that also tells me that person wants to be there.
How do they find that PA job? I mean, this sounds like a very rudimentary question, but where do they look?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Like it's rough. It's such a like getting figuring out like where to go to get these jobs. Like you go to things like Facebook has all kinds of groups. This assistant I was just telling you about, he's a member of all these like, I need an
Hmm.
assistant editor Facebook group. Just somehow find the
Mm.
people to reach out to. It's probably start on Facebook, get the names, find people like me. Like the truth is, my email address and probably phone number are on IMDb, and I get emails all the time of like, "Hey, I'm trying to bring," um, and and I always answer ultimately, and I always do what I can to help because it's a tough business to break into until you know
Yeah.
everybody. And so it's like find people like me, find people like my assistant editors, and say, I'm super interested. How do I do this? Can I intern for you? Like I always recommend, particularly for people coming in at the beginning, hopefully your overhead is pretty low at that point in your life. Like be willing to intern, be willing to say, um, I'll come in, I'll kick ass, I'll do whatever work you want me to do if you will show me some stuff. And that does two things. One is it you get to prove to these people that you're a worthy worker, that they would be like, oh, maybe we should hire this person as a PA. And then two, you're getting to learn all the things you need to learn. And I have another a guy who started as an intern for me on a on a movie, who by the end of that movie was a union assistant editor. He was an unpaid intern on day one and a union assistant editor at the end because he showed up. He was the first one there, last one out, uh, every day as an intern. And
I love that. Will you tell me about how the union works for editors? And I'd love to hear about ACE, how you become elected to ACE and what it means for you.
the Motion Picture Editors Guild, it protects the workers. Obviously, it's a union. It protects the workers. Getting in is kind of a strange animal. I don't know exactly how it works. This intern I was telling you about, who was a union assistant by the time we were done, we hadn't realized it, but we had started that movie as a non-union show. We didn't, the editing crew didn't know this at the time. And before they finished shooting, we found out, and the union found out, and of course we got turned into a union show. Well, he was already on the show as a paid PA at the time. We called him an apprentice, and so since he was already being paid as an apprentice film editor, they had to allow him
Cool.
in because the show was going union. So that's one way to get in. Other ways are you have to have a certain amount of hours worked on non-union projects uh, in the category that you're trying to get in as. ACE is an interesting one for me, ACE, because I just have not been as involved in ACE as I had wanted to be when I joined, and so getting elected to ACE. That's funny. I elected myself. So what I did was, because I used to go to the Ace Eddie Awards, right? The editing awards, when I could get a ticket or when I would get invited by a production company that I work with, and I just loved the camaraderie. It just was sort of the first time in my life, the first time I went to one of those award shows, I was like, wow, there's like hundreds of other people who do what I do, and they're talking about it, and I was never a part of an editor community. I didn't have friends that were editors. My best friend is an editor, but I wasn't part of that community, and so I'd go to these things and be like, wow, what an amazing.
It's such an isolating career. You're alone in the dark. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was so sort of turned on by it and how kind of cool it was that we all do things, and we all do things kind of differently, but with the same goals. And it was just so much fun. And so I decided, like, I want to be a part of this. And so I looked into it and started looking at all the things that they do. And they're really about connecting in the editing world and
Mm.
connecting outsiders to the editing world and letting the world
Yeah,
know what we do as an
great.
art and a craft. And I got so excited. So I called them and said, "What do I need to do to get in?" I happen to have been working down the hall from the woman who basically runs ACE. And she told me, she said, "You need two letters of recommendation from ACE editors. And then there's this process." And so the board of members had to agree that that was enough to interview me, and then I did an interview process with them. Um, they asked me a bunch of questions, and what would I be interested in doing, and I love teaching about editing. I love learning about editing, and so I was like, yeah, I want to be a part of all these panels that you have, and the voting registry, to vote for editors. And I started by doing a few panels and voting on some panels, and then um, life and work took over, and suddenly I'm like, I can't, and I travel a bunch for work, and suddenly I'm wondering, like, how do editors actually find the time to be a part of? And there's some guys, there women and men in ACE who do amazing stuff. Like there's an old buddy of mine named Glenn Garland, who every month he has a new interview with, like, the
Cool.
editors of the hottest new project that, like, there's so much cool stuff. And I'm not really doing any of it, but I'm certainly proud to be associated with
That's great. Does it lead to work sometimes, or does that networking lead to new collaborations?
maybe. I mean, that's always hard to say too. Like, I think every connection you make in this business
Mm.
ultimately potentially leads to work. Um, for me, I think the connections in ACE probably lead to more creative friendships,
Yeah.
and, like, people who can share the same, like, I'm experiencing this problem on this movie. Oh yeah,
Mhm.
I totally experienced that before, and this is the kind of thing. And so I love watching the panels that ACE puts on, because I love learning about other editors' processes. And sometimes I'm like, oh my God, how could they do it that way? That's ridiculous. And sometimes I'm like,
Mm.
whoa, that's exactly what I was looking for. So, you know, and for sure, if you're new in your career, and just coming up, and they have programs for assistant editors and up and coming editors, I think it's a great way to meet people that may turn into,
That's great.
work.
Will you tell me what led to your first meeting with Sylvester Stallone, and what it felt like sitting with this American film icon when apparently you guys really hit it off?
In 2003, my now ex-wife
Mm.
was a post-production executive at Universal, and a great editor who's also one of my mentors, named Don Zimmerman, was editing a crappy movie called The Cat in the Hat. And he and his two twin sons, Dean and Dan, were his first assistant editors. Both have gone on to become amazingly talented editors who work on incredible projects. Um, Not to toot other people's horns, but Dean just finished the
Oh,
fourth
cool.
season of Stranger
Uh,
Things, which was amazing. So Don at the time had been editing on a
mm,
program called Lightworks or Heavyworks for many years, and just the way the industry was going and technology, and this was going to be a big visual effects movie, he was switching over to Avid Media Composer. I had been editing on Avid Media Composer on real small, like, TV MOWs, and I had been at USA Network for a while on the Universal lot, and so Don was looking for, I still don't know what the job was that I did. It was sort of an assistant editor, but it was somebody really who could teach
mm,
the crew Avid Media Composer. So I'd been editing on Avid Media Composer for years. My wife, who was the post-production executive on that movie, asked me, would you be interested? It would be a great way to get in with a great editorial team and on a big movie. And I was like, absolutely. And I did. And so had a great working with relationship with Don and the boys and Dean and Dan, and they're all great friends today. And a few years later, Sly decided he was going to make this last episode of Rocky and called Don, who had been his editor for years throughout the 80s, and said, I want you to edit this movie. And Don was not available. And Sly, being Sly, said, well, what the hell are we going to do? And he said, you should meet this kid, Sean. Like, he knows what he's doing. He's blah, blah, blah. So he met me. And I remember that first meeting. It was crazy because I was like editing this short-lived TV show. I read the script for Rocky Balboa and I didn't think the script was very good. It didn't have a lot going on. It was like, and so I went in, and as I do when a director asks me, did you read the script? What do you think? I told him what my issues were with the script. I remember, God, it was so long ago. I remember thinking not much happened. So in reading the script, I remember feeling like Rocky's got a pretty good life. Like, yeah, Adrian's dead. It's kind of sad, but he owns a restaurant. Like the way it was written, and this is the way I realize now after years of working with Sly, this is the way he writes. He doesn't put a whole lot on the paper. He just puts, yeah, he just puts,
Okay.
interior restaurant night and then the dialogue. And that's it. He's not talking about, you know, looks people are
Mm.
giving, what they may be feeling in the moment, like this kind of things that you tend to read in other scripts where you're like, this is what's happening for this character, so you know how they'll be emoting. And so what I read was Rocky's got a pretty good life. He owns a restaurant. He's got a decent life. Maybe he's got some problems with his kid. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he just goes, I think I'm going to start fighting again.
And so to Sylvester, who's he's writing, directing, he's going to be acting. He doesn't need to write that because he knows what's happening, but you're not getting it reading that script. That's funny.
Right. And that's what he said to me. I said, look, I feel like there's no real inciting incident. Like, I don't understand what's driving this guy to like change, and Sly just looked at me and he goes, it's all in here. And I was like, all right. And it was, the truth is it really
Yeah.
was. And that's how he does what he does. It's how he writes and
In
directs.
an interview, you said that he oftentimes will give you notes like throughout the day. You're getting notes, and then you made the mistake once of staying late and making those revisions, only to have him come in the next morning with he had reworked it all in his mind that night and had a whole new vision. What's that like?
That was a great lesson I learned early on. So I'm trying to impress
Yeah,
not only a new director but Sylvester Stallone. Like that original Rocky movie, in some ways, was maybe the most
cool.
inspiring movie to me as a filmmaker. So and then I grew up. I was a kid in the '80s. I mean, that it was all Sylvester Stallone, and so trying to impress this guy, give me a bunch of notes, and then he just gets up at 6:30, 7 o'clock at night, and it's like, all right, I'll see you tomorrow. And so I assume I'm supposed to stay all night, like making this work. And what I realized quickly is he would forget 90% of what he said to me, and he would go home. Not only would he go home and
Yeah.
conceive a whole new thing. I mean, his brain is constantly moving. He would conceive a whole new thing. He would assume that he either told me about it or that I somehow should have. And then he'd come in and I'd go, all right, so let's look at the stuff that we talked about yesterday. And I'd hit play and he'd go, hang on a second. What about that thing that we talked about and I'm like, we didn't talk about that. And he's like, come on, man. Like, when are you going to show? So, another sort of version of Sly that I love to tell is it was on the Rambo 4, John Rambo actually, there was this scene in the rain, and he's having a conversation with a girl, and she convinces him to go on this mission. And it was a great scene. And the first time I put it together, it was just a beautiful scene. And we watched it the first time, had a couple of tweaks, and then it just went on. And we keep going through the film, and we keep watching the scene, and he wouldn't say anything. About 4 months into this process, we're watching the movie yet again, and we get to this scene, and he goes, Sean, 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 stop, stop. And I stop, and he says, when are you going to show me this scene the way I intended it when I shot it?
Oh,
It's like, really?
oh, you
What?
want to see that cut? Sure.
I'm like, okay, so you don't like it? Like, when did that
Oh man.
happen? He's quite a character, that guy, and we did some really cool work together, and we had some funny times, and I have a lot of funny stories about him.
You talked about a fight sequence. I think they shot in Las Vegas with like 9 cameras rolling, and then
Hmm.
and then he said, "Can you have a cut for me to look at like the next day?" And you had to race back to Burbank. What was that like?
Gosh, where do you get all this information? Like what? Yeah, so it was the first thing. I think it's the very first thing he shot on that movie was all those however many days of fight stuff. And I'm in Vegas, and I don't have an editing room in Vegas, and he literally says to me, they've got like 4 days worth of the shooting done. And he says, "Can you get this together tomorrow?" And I'm like, I guess. I'm not going to say no to the guy. It was my first task given to me by Sylvester Stallone. So yeah, so I ran back to LA and put the entire fucking last act of the movie together in a
Wow.
day. So as I'm putting it I put it together round by round. Um, first I put together round one,
Mm.
fight only, sent that off to my assistants to start putting sound effects to round two, and then when I get round one back with sound, after I got through the rest of the fight, I would start going through the material of I look at fights and sports competitions in movies as like concentric circles, right? So there's the actual fight, and then you have to start figuring out like what does each hit mean and who does it mean something to, and so then I
Yeah.
start thinking about whose face should I be cutting
Yeah.
to. So Rocky just got slammed in the face. What's the reaction from his opponent, and what's his reaction, and what's more important in that moment? And so I start thinking about those reactions, and then I
Mm.
start thinking about the reactions just outside of the ring by his trainers, and then of course his love interest on the way outside, and his son, and things like that.
It reminds me of something else I read you said about in a fight, each like sequence or each action has its own story arc, which seems like what you just described.
Yeah, I think it's that absolutely positively, and it's why I do a lot of sort of fix it jobs. Like I'll get called in
Mm.
people who have a movie and it's not quite working. Like what's not working, and particularly in action films and sports-based competition
Mm.
films, it is usually lacking what I just described. You might have super cool battles footage or fight footage or football footage, but if you're not telling the audience through editing what each beat in that
Hmm.
action sequence means and who does that mean something to, then it just becomes a
Yeah.
collage of like fast cuts and hits and whatever.
How challenging is it working with a director who's also the star of the film, who also wrote it? And what was that experience of? I imagine in a lot of ways you have to take on more of a director's cap yourself as you're sitting there with Sylvester Stallone figuring out what the story is.
What I found in working with him is what he desires, even in the moments where he's like, "Shut up, man! You don't know what you're talking about."
Mm.
Is he desires that combative, creative nature, right? He doesn't want a yes man. And so I definitely, in my experiences with him, had to take on that role, very
Mm.
specifically to his own performance and his own look.
Mm.
I got with him when his career had been in the toilet for many years. And now he's trying to, first of all, put an elegant end to the Rocky franchise, which he felt he had not done in Rocky Five, which I agree with, and to maybe revitalize his own career. And so there's a lot of vanity there. And so he's looking at himself on screen saying, God, I'm so old. I look, there's wrinkles, and I don't want to be on this angle. And a lot of my arguments with him, particularly on that movie, were um, that's exactly who you're supposed to be in this movie. That is who Rocky is. Like, that's the movie you wrote. And so we would have, we'd have a lot of arguments about that kind of stuff. And yeah, and again, like, you know, because his process is combative, we would argue. And because of what I was telling you earlier about how he'll oftentimes just forget what was rolling around in here yesterday and come in with a new idea, I was able to bring back things that I knew were best for the movie, sometimes by just telling him it was his idea.
That's funny. That's smart. I think you were maybe talking about Expendables when you said that he has a style of, in the edit, stripping away everything. And especially in a movie like that, I think 17, big movie stars in it, where you have so many different storylines you could focus on. What is that process like? And so he strips it away and then rebuild, or figures out where to build from there. How does that work?
It's a very interesting process and something that I found very frustrating at first until I realized what was happening. And the first time I experienced it was on Rocky Balboa. Burt Young, who plays Paulie in the movie, had done some interview somewhere and had said something, like one sentence that Sly was pissed about. He thought it was derogatory toward himself. And so suddenly he came up with this idea that nobody likes Paulie. Nobody cares about the character Paulie. We're taking Paulie out of the movie. And, my reaction to that is like, it was just yet another morning where he came in and was like, all right, we're doing, and I'm like, whoa, what? Having been a fan of Rocky my entire life, of course, that is so untrue. And I knew it was untrue. But what I found out was that there's a lot of brilliance that comes out of those frustrating moments. And so what I found out then, and and became part of how I worked with him from there on out, was um, always let him do it. I'd like to take Expendables 3 out of the mix only because I don't feel like me and my co-editor Paul Harb were ever able to get him back to where we were able to get him back to on Balboa and John Rambo. Because what our process was on those two movies, Balboa and John Rambo, is he tore it apart. He took everything out. No cut more than 2 seconds in the fight. I mean, it was horrible. And then we go through it together. The three of us would sit in the room getting to lock picture, and we would just argue. And we would say, dude, this is horrible. Nobody's going to understand what's happening here and why here. And he'd be like, well, what the hell should we do then? And then we, show him, and he'd be like, all right, that's fine. And slowly but surely, we would get the movie and the dialogue and the fights back to a place that we felt was not just confusing, but then would uphold the integrity of what we were
Yeah.
talking about earlier, and that each action moment is either telling a story, starting a story, or ending a story. And so on both of those movies, we were able to, through this process of the three of us banging it out in a room for a couple of weeks, able to get back to that place. Expendables 3 was a different scenario in which there were a lot of chefs in that kitchen. The last 2 weeks of locking picture was me in a room with Sly and like five executives, and Paul and I had been separated in sequences and rooms, and it just became this, like, I would try to do that process with him, and he would turn to his producers who just wanted him to stop editing, and they would be like, it's perfect, you're right. And so I kind of look at Expendables 3 as maybe the worst edited movie I walked away
Must
from.
have been hard. So much character development to squeeze in there.
Yeah, it really it was a huge movie, and I think that there's a much better movie there than what we ended up with. Um, which is frustrating for me. But in the end, it's an Expendables movie, and it's fun as hell, and it's an incredible cast, and like people just enjoy it. They enjoy it or they don't.
How do you exert, or I should say, protect your vision of a film and sort of maintain as much control as you can without stepping on a director's toes?
It's a real balance, and I think it's a I mean, I hear stories from directors about some editors who are great at it, some editors who are just
Mm,
horrible, and will some editors just won't do what a director is asking. um, uh, the way I yeah, it's like and they keep getting work, and God bless them, like if they can have all that control and be the director, I guess. Um, but for me, I feel like my job is, as we discussed earlier, do the very best you can with
yeah,
what's in front of you. I do not believe that my first cut of a scene is the best cut of the scene. It's the best cut of the scene that I could come up with in that moment and give myself enough time to edit the rest of the movie. But, I've got blinders on when I'm putting it together. I can't, it's hard to see the
mm,
big picture. Like, I don't really know the context of this scene until it's all together as
mm,
one big giant movie. And so the way I see my job in that regard that you just asked is like, my job is to do my best to give the director what they're asking for, um, to give the footage the best shake it can get, right? So like the footage is going to tell me things that the director hasn't seen or figured, and I'm going to do my best to make it work the best I can in that moment. And then when a director or producer gives me a note I disagree with, I'm arguing that note as I'm making that change, trying to do the best I can to make that work, right? And then the best thing happens often, which is I don't think this is going to work, and here's why. I'll tell you. Oh, wait. Okay, that's kind of cool, but what if we do this?
yeah,
Yeah, and so I have to be really careful not to let my ego get to, because if a director looks at something I did and they're like, "Yeah, that doesn't work at all." My ego says, "Oh, this person thinks I'm shit and I can't do this job." And maybe that person is right. And maybe I've been pulling the wool over everybody's eyes for 30 years. And so, and the truth is, it's not my movie. I'm not the director. So my job is to do my best, always give my strong creative opinions, and I will argue my point to the point where the director says, "No, no, no, let's do it my way." And I'll drop it and do it their way. And then I'll bring it up a day later, 2 days later, a week later, a month later. Sometimes when I bring it up, I say, "You know what? I so disagreed with this, but you were right." And and sometimes, like on one of my last movies, I was just sitting with my director. We were talking about this, and there's that one thing that these directors decided it's going in the movie, and I'm like, it should not be in this movie. And of course they win. And so, there's always that one thing.
was this American Underdog or what was that?
Yes,
Tell me about working on that one.
such a great experience. I love these guys. So John and Andy Irwin are these. They're really they're faith-based filmmakers out
Mm,
of Franklin, Tennessee. They make really good movies. I'm not, I'm like a atheist New York Jew, and they're like these kind of Southern uh, faith-based Jesus filmmakers.
yeah,
And but I watched, they called me, and they had been at Andy, two brothers, Andy and John Irwin. Andy, they're self-made filmmakers. I mean, they self-taught. They've made their own movies. They've done so well with their faith-based movies. And having watched a bunch of them, I can see why. There's a lot of faith-based movies out there that don't have to be good, right? That audience tends to show up just because it's faith based, just because it's Jesus is predominantly featured in the movie. These guys make really good movies that happen to be faith-based
Yeah.
films, and what I really appreciate about those movies, particularly sports-based competition movies, is those are my favorite movies. Movies about perseverance, faith in whatever, faith in self, faith in God, faith in something larger than
Yeah.
yourself. They called me in to work on that movie. They also knew they had a movie that was a bit bigger than just their faith-based audience, and which I absolutely agreed with. And so I went down this road with them. It was a crazy road. Like they were like a $65 million budget movie when they first called me. They were about to go into production. COVID hit. They shut everything down. Lionsgate said, "You're now a $25 million budget movie if you want to make this movie."
Wow.
And they went back out to all their people and they were like, "Okay, we have a lot less money to pay you now." And so, when I meet people as I get older, I it becomes more and more important to me to work with people I just enjoy
Oh yeah.
being with. And I love, like, these guys are amazing. They become good friends, and so I was like, all right, I'm in, because I love the people. I thought I didn't know them very well, but I love the story,
Yeah.
and I wanted to be a part of making that story. And so we did it. Went to Tennessee, worked with these guys. Andy had been editing all of his own movies up to that point, and we've since talked a lot. We've become good friends, and he told me that he felt a little intimidated about editing with me. Like, he wants to control his vision, and he's used to doing all the editing himself. And he had first said to me, "I'm just going to let you edit. I'm going to try to step back." And then he wanted to get into the editing process, which he did. And it was just a great, fantastic creative collaboration between the two of
Would
us.
you guys send cuts back and forth, or would you sit in the same edit bay? And how's that collaboration work?
He was most concerned with, like, here, these are the things in my head about the opening of the movie, and then the last act, all the
Mm,
football, the big,
yeah.
big Super Bowl. So he just sort of dove into that stuff, and he would send. So I mean, I obviously had put the whole movie together before he started touching anything. And then he just sort of took a chunk and would work on it for a while, and sometimes call me into his room and say, "Here's what I'm working on. What do you think?" And I'd say, "I love this idea. I hate that." We would just have this very open, collaborative conversation. And then he would hand it over to me. He felt that, like, he'd be like, "Okay, here's what I want. Now do your thing and make
Mm,
it great."
cool.
Um, and it was really nice because I there was we talked about it, and we were both able to let go of ego in it. And he took my stuff and tore it up and redid it, and then I would take his stuff and do what I thought it needed to be more effective than what it was. And usually we were both, like, super happy with the
That's
outcome.
cool. That sounds fun.
Yeah, it was neat.
Shifting gears to your work in TV, how would you compare the experience for you as an editor of working on TV versus films, and what are the things that you like about both, about each?
I always prefer working on movies for two reasons. One is the pay rate is much better for editors like me in
Oh,
movies.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, much
Mhm.
better. TV, there's usually a cap on rates for editors in TV, and it's quite a bit lower than in movies. So that's one thing, but also, the thing I love about TV is it really, it like sharpens my skills. It's fast. It is fast paced. Like, they shoot, let's say a 43-minute episode in 8 days. You have 2 days to have an editor's cut done. You get 4 days for a director's cut if you're lucky, and then the showrunner will come in and do like 4 days, 5 days of notes, and then you're like locking picture, and you're up,
It's
and
like
you're
2 weeks
yeah, and you're already getting,
episode.
and while you're prepping for post production sound and visual effects and all that other stuff, you're getting dailies on your next episode.
Wow, which you have to start working on already. You have to start assembling those.
I will say this. I'm also talking about network TV shows because
Okay.
I'm trying to think of like streaming stuff that I've worked. I think from what I can tell, I've only done one, I guess two now, like streaming. Like I did like one episode of Lovecraft Country for HBO, but that was also they were already going for like a year and a half. They had shot everything. They called me. It was a fix-it job. There was one episode the showrunner was not happy with.
Hmm.
I came in, I cut it from scratch. That was way more like working on a movie. It was great,
So the timelines are more like features for the streamers, maybe.
for sure. I think so.
What is something nice that someone has done for you in your career that's helped you get where you are today?
That first job I got editing that very low budget, very ambitious. It was a mock talk show for the E network, I think. And I had no credits, no editing credits whatsoever. And I had cold called this head of post production at a big TV company, and he had known my dad many years earlier. And he heard my last name and he said, "Are you any relation to Eric?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm his son." And he was like, "All right, get in here. Let's have a talk." I guess that's probably the nicest thing because that was the beginning of my editing career. There was no reason for anybody to give me a job as an editor at that point. I like I said, I didn't come up through the assistant editor ranks as an editor. Many do. A lot. I end up bringing all of my assistants ultimately end up, co-editing with me, and then they go off on their own. That wasn't my story, and this guy just pushed me on these people, these poor people. I mean, I didn't know what the heck I was doing. Yeah, that was a
That's
great thing.
that's awesome. How is the role of the editor changing? So for editors who are maybe earlier in their careers, what can they do right now to prepare for the future?
I would say the role of the editor has already changed, right? Like, so I'm thinking about when I started in the '80s, and the role of the editor was, like I was saying earlier. Right now, if I get a note I disagree with, I'm doing the note as I'm arguing the note because it doesn't take me very long to do it, and I can easily undo it or do a new version of it, or
Hmm.
and all that
Yeah,
happens so quickly. Back then, a director would say, "I want to do this," and the editor would say, "Here's why I don't think that's going to work. Because if I do that,
it's a big commitment.
yeah, I'm going to have to send you away for a day. And then you're going to come back and look at it. And then we're going to have changes, and I'm going to send you away
Interesting.
again."
Yeah,
And so
right.
I think certainly that's the biggest way the job of the editor has changed. Um, how it will change, that remains to be seen. I couldn't tell you. I think it's, for me,
We'll find out.
we will find out. I don't see anything currently in technology that would have the role of the editor change enormously like it has, in the last like 40 years.
Interesting. And finally, what are you working on now? What can we look forward to?
Netflix movie called The Curse of Bridge Hollow is a fun sort of kids horror comedy Halloween.
Awesome.
Yeah, and then I'm The Senior, which is another football movie.
Awesome. Well, I can't wait. Sean, this was great. Thank you so much for all this wisdom, great stories. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks, Nick. I had a great time.